The Archivist of Useless Questions. Part 1. The Archive. He walked through the city the way a hand passes over polished stone, aware of its coolness and trusting the surface to remain unbroken. People occupied the streets in an even distribution, enough to create movement without ever becoming a crowd. They traveled with the calm of those who had no reason to arrive before anyone else. Doors opened early, vehicles approached before they were called, and signs confirmed decisions that the city had already anticipated. Standing still for a minute was enough to feel the city correcting itself around you. A vehicle altered its route. A patch of shade widened across the pavement. Pedestrian flows opened a quiet space and closed again once you moved. The system exercised its power through patient accommodation, confident that comfort would accomplish what force once had. He crossed a plaza that had been a market. The stalls were gone, replaced by benches, shade membranes, and fountains whose water rose to the same measured height in every season. Across one wall, a distant shoreline adjusted the rhythm of its waves to the heartbeats of passers-by. The city called this considerate. The archivist wore ordinary clothes because a uniform would have overstated his importance. A token hung from his lanyard, beside a recorder the size of a matchbox, and a thin slate carried a schedule that revised itself in silence. His name appeared nowhere. Doors knew him by title. Archivist. Third tier, cultural continuity, listening operations. The title entered each building with the impersonal authority of a temperature reading. His first interview room was spare by design. A table, 2 chairs, neutral light, and a small plant in the corner. The plant's leaves were glossy and nearly identical. Someone had placed it there to introduce a living thing without allowing life to become an inconvenience. A man waited inside. He was middle-aged, well-fed, careful in his posture, with eyes trained to rest briefly on everything. The archivist sat, placed the recorder between them, and activated it. State your consent for archival. The man recited the standard words fluently. Consent had become a civic reflex, closer to opening a door than revealing a decision. On the slate, the first question was already waiting. What should be decided by people? The man smiled with the uncertainty of someone reaching for a language he had once spoken every day. I don't know, he said. Small things such as who I live with, where I take my walks, which stories I keep returning to. He studied his hands. It sounds strange when I say it aloud, like a child describing freedom. The archivist listened with the discipline of a witness. Reassurance could bend an answer, and advice belonged to other rooms. His task began and ended with preservation, to hold a temporary human utterance steady long enough for it to outlive the speaker, the room, and the hour in which it had been said. What would you risk, he asked, if failure carried no lasting punishment? The man raised his eyes toward the ceiling, searching memory rather than architecture. Embarrassment, he said at last. I would risk being wrong where other people could see me. The penalties for that have mostly disappeared. Exactly. A tired amusement entered the man's voice. That is why it feels weightless. The world forgives the mistake before I have time to make it. The archivist recorded the sentence. It remained between them with a density the room had not been designed to hold. He moved to the next prompt. What is a good life when nothing is demanded? A laugh escaped the man, abrupt enough to disturb the neutral air. He gathered himself before replying. A life that feels real? I know how vague that sounds. I just don't know how to measure real anymore. There it was in the first session of the day, a word large enough to mean everything and worn enough to mean almost nothing. Real. The session ended with a standardized closure. The archivist pocketed the recorder and left, while the door sealed the room with quiet finality. In the corridor, people waited in chairs calibrated to prevent impatience. Their hands held neither documents nor bags, their problems, if they had them left, no visible weight on the body. They waited with the composed attention of citizens performing a minor public duty. Outside, a child ran across the plaza, stopped, turned, and ran again. Each approach to another person ended in a graceful correction several steps before collision. The city had taught children to anticipate invisible boundaries so well that caution looked instinctive. The Archivist slate refreshed Session 2, Residential Complex 11, East Ring Session 3, Education Module Adult Re-Entry, Session 4, Public Rest Space, Shoreline Promenade. He followed the route. The second interviewee was a woman who spoke quickly, piling one thought over another before either could acquire too much importance. What should be decided by people, he asked. Nothing. Everything. She shook her head, annoyed with the answer before he could react. Sorry. You want something coherent, I want the answer you have. My answer is a mood. That is still an answer. When he asked what she would risk, her speed deserted her. Needing someone, she said. This system is so kind about dependence that it makes dependence feel childish. I would risk needing someone who could disappoint me. He recorded the change in her voice, along with the words. By the third session, the prescribed questions felt less like keys than ceremonial gestures made before doors that had already opened. People answered anyway. The exchange demanded an effort that carried no material consequence, and many left with the subdued relief of having lifted something and discovered they still possessed strength. Between addresses, the Archivist crossed streets maintained at night by machines too quiet to wake anyone. Graffiti survived only in designated districts. Elsewhere, a wall erased an unauthorized mark before its author reached the next corner. The speed of removal gave protest a peculiar loneliness. A person could shout into the city and watch the city absorb the sound without changing expression. From a glass corridor above the transit line, he watched driverless vehicles move in continuous formation. Spacing adjusted by fractions, lanes braided and separated, and the whole network proceeded without the drama of decision. He wondered whether the world was still being driven in any meaningful sense, or whether stable behavior had replaced the need for an active hand. The thought accompanied him to the shoreline promenade. The public rest space overlooked another projection of the sea. Its light crossed the floor with such precision that people shifted their feet when the artificial tide approached. They spoke quietly, preserving the atmosphere even though every component of the scene could repair itself. His final interviewee appeared young, perhaps 20, perhaps 40. Age had become difficult to read once. Work and illness stopped writing themselves so clearly on faces. The man leaned forward with an intensity that gave the room a center. What should be decided by people? The Archivist began. Do you still record this? The young man asked, when nobody reads it. The protocol supplied an answer before the Archivist had time to examine the question. It is preserved for continuity. For whom? Future research. Tenderness softened the young man's expression. It was the tenderness one might offer a child repeating a story he still needed. You have never met a researcher, he said. The Archivist allowed the silence to remain. I will answer your questions, the young man continued. You should answer mine as well. If no one reads this, why does it exist? The next prompt glowed patiently on the slate. The Archivist looked down and read it because reading was easier than replying. What is a good life when nothing is demanded? A good life, the young man said, is one where you can tell the difference between your choices and the world's autopilot. The Archivist recorded the sentence. For the first time, the recorder's weight drew his attention. The small device felt crowded with all the voices it had carried into silence. He ended the session and walked away. Behind him, the projected water continued its immaculate movement. The waves had no memory of the question, though the men who had sat beside them did. On the road home, a bulletin display showed civic metrics in gentle colors. Stability appeared everywhere. The graphs contained no emergencies, and the passing citizens glanced at them with the casual trust earlier eras had given to weather reports. He had always assumed his work belonged to that stability. The assumption had required no defense because nobody had challenged it, least of all the people who designed the questions. That evening, in his assigned room, he transferred the day's recordings into the archive, upload, complete entry classification, low impact, high comfort. Thank you for your service. He remained at the edge of the bed after the screen went dark. Irritation moved through him, faint but persistent, directed less at any person than at the ease with which the world accepted everything. A confession, a fear, a question capable of rearranging a life, all entered the same system and returned as confirmation. At the proper hour, the room dimmed its lights. He slept lightly and woke before the slate brightened. The schedule continued in the morning with perfect composure. Session numbers, addresses, travel time, every line suggested that yesterday had concluded without remainder. The young man's question survived outside that order. If no one reads it, why does it exist? The question stripped the word archive of its dignity. Preservation had sounded like a form of care. Now he saw that storage and reception could drift infinitely far apart. A sentence might survive for centuries intact and untouched, while its meaning waited for the encounter that alone could complete it. He imagined the hidden archive beneath the city's calm. Voices accumulating year after year, a second population sealed in perfect memory. Their words might outlast the speakers and the institutions that had requested them. Longevity offered no guarantee of consequence. He dressed and joined the morning route. Doors opened, vehicles arrived, and the city corrected itself around him with undiminished grace. Yet, every assigned question now carried another, invisible question behind it. Who would receive the answer, and what would receiving require? Part 2. The weight of speech. Within a few months, the archivist could predict the shape of an answer before anyone spoke. The words still varied, but they bent toward the same small group of needs. People reached for real more often than happy, and for useful more often than free. They said, "I don't know what I'm for," with the exposed bewilderment earlier generations had reserved for questions of love. The apologies interested him most. Before admitting a desire, people lowered their voices and glanced toward the recorder, seeking permission from a machine that had asked them to speak. They seemed embarrassed by the scale of their own inner lives. Memory could make any pattern feel anecdotal, so he began a private list. The protocol considered recurrence a statistical matter. He wanted to preserve the language in which recurrence arrived. "I feel like a guest in my own life. Everything is fine. That's the problem. The world seems to be living correctly without me. I miss being wrong when it mattered. I miss needing someone and being needed back." He kept the list to himself because no recipient suggested itself. The archive accepted every session with the same frictionless confirmation, leaving millions of sentences available to a future act of attention, until somebody chose to look availability was only a more elegant form of absence. The sessions continued. Doors opened, consent was given, and the questions traveled from his slate into rooms where people had been waiting, sometimes for years, to hear themselves answer. One afternoon, he passed through an administrative hub and noticed an unattended terminal. Such lapses were rare, and rarity had begun to pull at his attention. Across the screen, above a field of muted graphs, a report title appeared: Listening Operations Effect on Civic Drag. Correlation Summary: Internal Use. The archivist stood beside the terminal until curiosity acquired the weight of a decision. Then he pressed his token to the reader. The screen recognized his title and unfolded the report without hesitation. Its visual language differed from the public displays. Here, the colors sharpened, confidence intervals spread around hard lines, and uncertainty appeared as something measured rather than something concealed. The report belonged to people who could tolerate consequence. He read slowly at first, then with gathering urgency. The archive served no deliberative role. Policy lived beneath the level of conversation now, formed by systems whose models moved faster than public reasoning. The recordings entered a different process. They trained an index called civic drag, defined as the accumulated friction between what citizens experienced and what the optimized world provided. The diagrams translated private suffering into a cascade of probabilities. A rise in civic drag predicted withdrawal from public life, then episodes of collective unrest. Beyond the second threshold came acute loneliness, addiction, and self-harm. Each movement increased the likelihood of the next, and the model treated the sequence with the same clinical attention once given to storms crossing an ocean. Interventions began long before a crisis became visible. Leisure allotments expanded. Social programs appeared in a person's schedule with the delicacy of suggestions. Therapeutic content adjusted itself to private vocabulary. Public spaces changed their lighting, music, and density. Encounters labeled curated serendipity placed compatible strangers within conversational distance. Every measure lowered the curve for a while. Listening operations proved unusually effective. After an interview, civic drag fell across nearly every demographic. People returned home calmer after naming the absence in their lives, even when the conditions producing that absence remained untouched. The questions created no policy pressure because pressure was precisely what the program had learned to remove. The discovery contained no villain and offered no clean conspiracy. Speech had become a regulatory organ of the city. Private truth entered the archive as pressure, emerged as data, and guided the systems that restored emotional stability. The arrangement was humane by every available measure. That was what disturbed him. He stayed at the terminal while people passed through the hub, each person trusting his token and posture enough to ignore him. The city had granted him access because classification mattered more than intention. It knew he belonged there. It had no category for the difference between permission and understanding. When he finally left, he walked without a destination. The day's voices returned in pieces. The man who wanted the risk of public error, the woman whose answers were a mood, the young man by the water saying, "You've never met a researcher." The sentence endured because it was true. Back in his room, he opened the private list and added another line. "I suspect the world is kind because it has learned the utility of kindness." A notification appeared before he could close the slate. Supervisor review required topic. Question set deviation risk. Officially, his questions remained within protocol. The system had registered his access instead, or perhaps some smaller shift that the archivist himself could not measure. An extra second of silence during interviews, a road taken too slowly, the growing distance between a prompt and his voice. The following morning, his schedule sent him west. Interpretation Office, West Annex. The annex came from an earlier period of the city, when buildings still disclosed the compromises of construction. Corridors met at imperfect angles, the walls carried no projections, and the air held the mineral smell of paper. Someone might have engineered the scent for historical effect, although here, for once, authenticity seemed less important than atmosphere. A man waited in a room lined with shelves. Some volumes were genuine, their spines had softened from handling, and several leaned into the gaps left by missing neighbors. The man had arranged himself with equal care. His clothes were forgettable, his face attentive, his authority expressed through the absence of any visible title. "You're the archivist," he said. "I am one of them, third tier." The man glanced at the token on the lanyard. "How does that feel? Like a classification?" A crease appeared at the corner of the man's mouth. "Good. A classification should at least have the courage to feel administrative." He indicated a chair and sat across from him. Between them stood a low table bearing 2 glasses of water and a single paper notebook. The notebook had been used, a thumbprint darkened the lower edge of its cover. "You accessed an internal summary," the man said. "Yes, and now you're wondering whether your work is a form of care or a form of control." The archivist watched him. "You make the difference sound obvious. It used to be easier to pretend it was. What is your role here?" "I interpret." The man placed one hand on the notebook, lightly enough that the gesture looked habitual. "Sometimes I explain. Mostly I keep certain concepts available until somebody needs language for an experience the system can only measure." Who needs them? Whoever still feels friction. The archivist heard the official phrasing rise in his mind and chose his own words. My work releases pressure. It does, the man said. It also gives a person a mirror for an hour. A release valve prevents rupture. The fact that it serves a vessel does not make the relief imaginary. Are people vessels now? We always were. Bodies manage pressure. Families manage it. Empires, religions, markets, weather, every age built containers for human force and called the successful one civilization. The man leaned back. You have discovered that the present is managed and begun to imagine the past as freedom. The past merely hid its machinery better. The archivist felt resistance gather behind his ribs. So the machinery excuses itself by being ancient. No. History excuses nothing. It only prevents surprise from dressing itself as moral clarity. For a moment, neither spoke. Dust had collected along the upper shelves, beyond the reach of whatever cleaning system served the annex. The archivist found himself looking at it with unreasonable affection. The man followed his gaze. There is an old name for what you are feeling. The Matrix feeling? The suspicion that your life has become an interface and that reality is happening somewhere behind it. That term is discouraged. Discouraged is a long way from extinct. Then, where are the people pulling the strings? That is the part the metaphor gets wrong. A string can shape a life without a hand at the other end. Biology pulls, culture pulls, prediction pulls. A system can produce direction through millions of local corrections, each one reasonable until the result feels designed by an intelligence that never sat down to design it. So agency disappears. The man shook his head. Agency becomes less theatrical. Control over outcomes was always a flattering story. Human beings chose inside biology, accident, inheritance, and the desires of other people. Most choices began as patterns they never selected. What remains is stance. What you commit to, what you practice, what you permit to become sacred through repetition. That sounds private. Local, the man corrected, and his voice grew warmer. Embodied, shared at human scale, meaning is contact. He turned toward the window. Below them, the optimized city moved in coordinated currents. Vehicles adjusted their spacing without stopping. Pedestrians crossed before signals appeared because signals had already anticipated them. From the height of the annex, the whole arrangement seemed to breathe with a confidence no individual creature possessed. Smoothness is comfortable, the man said. It has also become an aesthetic, a moral preference, almost a theory of reality. We trust the surface that never catches and the conversation that never wounds. But imagine living inside a world that never returns your weight. After a while, comfort begins to resemble sensory deprivation. People wonder whether they are awake because nothing has answered their presence. The archivist felt the thought connect to hundreds of recorded sentences. Reality as resistance, the hold beneath a hand, another person's refusal, the stubborn material that preserved evidence of effort. Then, what do you propose? He asked. A return to scarcity? Scarcity will return whenever it pleases. It requires no advocacy from us. The task is to build new engines of meaning while abundance lasts engine. Games with stakes people consent to, commitments that survive mood, craft, service, difficult friendships, practices that permit failure and remember it. A person needs some part of life where the world can answer no, and where the response to that no remains theirs to make. A soft tone sounded from the wall. For an instant, a pale circle appeared beside the door. Emotional load elevated. Sarin available, except dismiss. The man reached over and pressed dismiss. The circle vanished. The archivist knew sarin as a therapeutic adjunct, one of those words encountered so often that its history had disappeared. Why did it offer that now? Because this conversation has crossed the threshold where discomfort becomes predictive. And you dismissed it. I wanted to finish the thought. He opened the notebook and turned several pages until he found a name written alone at the top. Dr. Mara Van. She developed serine during the displacement years, he said. A remarkable compound. It separates distress from urgency without clouding thought. A person can grieve and still eat, still sleep, still speak to a child without passing the terror forward. Clinics measured suicide reductions no social intervention had ever achieved. The archivist looked at the blank wall where the offer had appeared. So it worked. Completely. Durable mistakes often begin as successful solutions. He ran a finger beneath the name. Once predictive care improved, Serene moved beyond clinics. The system learned the exact moment when anguish was likely to become dangerous and placed relief within reach. No mandate was necessary. The offer arrived during a person's worst minute, and most people accept it. What is the mistake? Pain carries noise, cruelty, and useless repetition. It also carries information. An emotion interrupted early may never ripen into a question. Serene lowers the suffering and the signal together. The man closed the notebook. Listening operations allows discontent to be spoken. Serene helps the body recover after speaking. Together they form an elegant circuit. Expression, relief, return to function. Very little human pressure survives long enough to become judgment. The archivist pictured the civic drag graphs and understood why their lines had seemed so clean. Are you saying people should be left in pain? I am saying relief should remain a choice made with knowledge of what else it may quiet. Mercy becomes dangerous when it loses the ability to distinguish a wound from a warning. Outside, the city continued its calm circulation. Somewhere below, thousands of private systems were offering the right comfort at the right moment. The archivist touched the recorder in his pocket. Where does UBI fit into this? The man's expression carried the fatigue of an argument repeated across decades. UBI became a symbol, so people treat it as a cause. The transformation began elsewhere. He poured water into both glasses before continuing. Optimization outperformed human coordination in one field after another. Energy stabilized, logistics stopped behaving like a permanent emergency, and waste became a solvable routing problem. Scarcity thinned unevenly, then quickly. The political idea of a basic income had existed for generations. Its implementation became ordinary administration once paid labor ceased to describe either contribution or survival. His account had the flat clarity of institutional history. By the time UBI arrived, the decisive change had already taken place. Income and necessary work had separated, and the payments simply closed the gap. And yet, the archivist said, and yet work had carried far more than income. It gave time a shape, made status legible, forced contact with strangers, and placed consequence inside the week. For many people, it served as a purpose generator. They resented every morning and depended upon every evening. UBI sustained the body, while that hidden architecture fell away. The archivist felt his own occupation shift again. He had believed he was collecting opinions for a political process that no longer needed them. Perhaps he was collecting friction for minds that did. Was the change a mistake? It was an achievement for which we prepared badly. We removed an ancient load-bearing structure and celebrated the suffering that disappeared with it. The celebration was deserved. Then we assumed meaning would continue standing on its own. The recorder seemed heavier in the archivist's pocket, because it now belonged to a system he understood and to a purpose he had only begun to choose. What should I do? The question embarrassed him the moment it left his mouth. He had come seeking an account of agency and immediately asked another person to direct his. The man spared him the lesson. Record honestly. Change the questions when the assigned ones can no longer reach the person in front of you. Your questions are one of the few interfaces left between the smooth world and the need for contact. How far can I go? Far enough to discover where a boundary lives. The system will tell you when you have touched it. Afternoon light had shifted across the shelves by the time they rose. Their meeting ended without a conclusion. Yet the absence felt deliberate rather than unfinished. The interpreter offered neither mission nor protection. He had served a quieter purpose. He kept unresolved human judgment alive inside an order built to resolve everything. In the corridor, the archivist's slate updated. Question set update, optional, recommended, reduce existential load. Note: citizen comfort priority. The system had already registered the meeting in its own language. At his next session, a woman with calm eyes and folded hands waited across the table. She gave consent, then answered the familiar opening question with the familiar triad: relationships, taste, small, local loyalties. The archivist could feel the next assigned prompt waiting on his slate. He set it aside. "When do you feel real?" he asked. The question broke her practiced rhythm. She looked toward the window, laughed once from embarrassment, and began again more slowly. "When something resists me, when I have to try." "What do you try?" "I climb in the old district." Her hands unfolded as she spoke, and he saw pale abrasions across the pads of her fingers. "The walls there keep their true angles. A hold stays difficult after you miss it. The rope catches because another person is holding the line, and you know the difference. When I reach the top, I can trace every movement that brought me there. The route cannot flatter me." "Why return?" "Because the outcome belongs to the climb. It can go wrong through my own error, and when it goes right, I know the world did not arrange the feeling for me." The archivist recorded her answer while relief moved quietly through him. The human mind still recognized consequence as nourishment when consequence arrived in a form it had chosen. His slate flashed, phrasing flagged. Existential amplification. He allowed the warning to fade. That night, the upload interface omitted its usual things. Accepted entry classification. Unknown. The word stayed on the screen longer than necessary. Unknown was the first answer the archive had given him that felt open rather than complete. Part 3. The last question. He began seeking the rough places, although seeking was almost too dramatic a word for what he did. He simply adjusted his routes. He took the longer corridor when it passed a workshop, accepted sessions in districts whose streets retained their old gradients, and stayed after interviews when the people across from him seemed willing to continue. Gratitude and unease accompanied him together. The smooth world fed people, healed injuries that had once ruined whole lives, and prevented the stupid, ordinary deaths that history had mistaken for fate. Its competence deserved admiration, yet a life could be protected so completely that protection became the only relationship left between a person and the world. The global system tolerated local pockets of imperfection because it no longer needed uniformity to remain stable. In one district, people built furniture by hand. They argued over joints and angles, worked a piece of timber until its grain changed the plan, and left their mistakes visible long enough to learn from them. A finished table carried the hours that had made it. Its slight asymmetry was the maker's signature, even when no signature had been cut into the wood. Another district kept schools where answers arrived slowly. A student could remain confused for an afternoon without a learning assistant rescuing the lesson, and teachers treated the discomfort as part of the curriculum. The system watched these schools with the mild concern it reserved for voluntary danger. Performance data arrived with careful recommendations. The teachers read the recommendations, thanked the system, and continued at human speed. The archivist recorded these places with the same attention he gave the interview rooms. Curiosity protected him from nostalgia. The rough districts contained vanity, tenderness, cruelty, generosity, and every other old human ingredient. Friction guaranteed no wisdom. It merely allowed the world to answer back. One afternoon, his schedule led him to a youth re-entry module. The room was bright and excessively clean, with surfaces designed to survive years of use without acquiring a history. A young person waited at the table, small-bodied and wide-eyed, holding the attentive stillness of someone raised among systems that had competed gently for every spare moment of attention. The archivist set down the recorder and asked for consent. The youth recited the standard words with effortless fluency. Along the edge of his slate, the assigned questions began to glow. He turned the screen face down before they could determine the room, then settled into the silence with the youth. At first, the silence felt administrative, an interval waiting to be corrected. As it lengthened, it changed character. The ventilation became audible. Somewhere beyond the wall, a trolley crossed a seam in the floor. After nearly a minute, the youth spoke. "Are you allowed to do this? To sit here?" "To sit here and ask nothing." "I believe I am," the archivist said. The answer became less certain once he heard it aloud, yet he let it stand. The youth studied him with a frankness that adults usually train themselves to conceal. "My instructor said you record useless questions." The archivist could have explained the program, the classifications, the official meaning of continuity. Instead, he said, "That is one description." This seemed to satisfy them. They leaned forward, forearms on the table. Did it feel more real before? The words were simple enough for a child to carry and large enough to contain an entire future mythology. One day, their generation might imagine the past as a time when every choice mattered and every person stood in direct conversation with the world. They would forget how often the world had answered with hunger, disease, humiliation, or silence. They would also sense correctly that consequence had once reached people with less mediation. Both truths lived inside the question, tangled beyond the reach of a clean reply. The archivist rested his hands on the table. He remembered the interpreter in the annex speaking of contact, and the climber describing the hold beneath her fingers. He wanted to offer the youth neither advertisement nor warning. Certainty would turn either one into propaganda. "Before," he said at last. Reality arrived with less invitation. It came through work, weather, family, money, the body. Much of it was unfair. People spent enormous parts of their lives surviving problems we now know how to prevent. The youth waited. Their patience had none of the practiced softness of the interview rooms. It was active, almost demanding. "People were as foolish as we are," he continued, "and cruelty had more room to move. The difference was weight. Consequence attached itself to ordinary decisions and stayed there. Sometimes that weight clarified a life, sometimes it crushed one. People were poor at telling the two apart." And now, the archivist looked at the sealed surfaces around them, each designed to absorb where before where became visible. "Now the world catches many consequences before they reach you. That has saved more lives than either of us can imagine. It also means that certain forms of reality must be entered deliberately. You choose a practice, a promise, a person, a difficult thing whose answer you cannot control, and you remain when it begins to resist you." The youth lowered their eyes to the tabletop and traced a faint seam with one finger. "That sounds exhausting. It can be. Is it worth it?" He considered the old reflex of reassuring them. "You find out afterward," he said, "that uncertainty is part of what makes the answer yours." The youth looked up. For the first time, their expression lost its careful neutrality. Something in the answer had irritated them or interested them, and the archivist felt grateful for either possibility. He closed the session without the standard conclusion. Walking back through the corridor, he understood that he had become an influence. However small, the word once sounded dangerously close to control. Now he saw another possibility. One person could give another permission to approach an experience that the world had learned to smooth away. That evening he returned to his assigned room, placed the recorder on the desk, and activated it for himself. The schedule contained no entry for the session. He spoke steadily, surprised by how long the words had been arranging themselves in him. "I was hired to collect answers that do not change outcomes," he said. "For a long time I believed that made them useless." He listened to the room for a moment. Beyond the wall, water moved through pipes with the quiet efficiency of every hidden system in the city. "I understand them differently now. An answer can give weight to an experience before that experience disappears. It reminds a person that an inner life has occurred, even when the world has no use for it." He let the sentence settle. Explanation could easily harden into doctrine, and doctrine was another machine for deciding in advance what a person ought to feel. He chose one final thought: meaning survives. What disappeared were the old engines that once produced it without asking. Work had been one engine, scarcity another. Obligation, reputation, survival, faith, family, for most of history, meaning arrived as a side effect of pressures that rarely sought permission. Their disappearance had lifted an ancient burden. It had also transferred responsibility to people who had never been taught how to carry it. Now, he said, meaning arrives by invitation, he uploaded the entry accepted. Entry, classification, flagged, non-standard visibility, internal only. The verdict possessed the courtesy of a locked door. His words would be preserved with all the unstable thoughts the system considered worth keeping and unwise to circulate. Somewhere inside the archive they would join the second population he had begun to imagine, millions of voices held in perfect readiness, waiting for a listener who might never come. The next morning, his slate displayed fewer sessions, gentler routes, and a replacement set of questions concerned with preferences, routines, and general comfort. The system had absorbed his deviation and answered in its customary language, care translated into restriction. He read the new schedule once, placed the slate in his pocket, and walked to the old district. In a workshop near the climbing walls, two makers were arguing over a joint that refused to close. One held the timber steady, while the other adjusted the cut by fractions. Their disagreement had no moderator, no predictive aid, and no guarantee of a pleasant conclusion. The wood kept its own counsel. Each attempt left a mark. The archivist stayed until the joint finally met. The makers ran their thumbs over the seam, already discussing the next imperfection, while evening gathered in the narrow street outside. Beyond the district, the city continued in its immense, gentle competence, smooth, kind, stable, and correct. He felt no need to condemn its mercy or surrender his judgment to it. There were lives inside the polished world and lives along its rough edges, and he could walk between them, carrying questions from one to the other, the way embers are protected on a long journey. Small, stubborn evidence that warmth could still be made.